Night after night, the southern air carried the same promise and the same lie. Somewhere between the pines and the low marsh, freedom whispered, and men with guns followed that whisper like hounds. In the 1840s, slave catchers were not shadows or villains hiding from the law. They were the law, deputized, paid per head, welcomed in taverns and courthouses. They moved across counties with dogs, lanterns, and warrants folded in their pockets. What few of them noticed was the woman who watched them arrive. Her name does not appear cleanly in the records. Sometimes she is called Hannah. In other fragments, she is only the girl from the river place. She was enslaved on a small property near a trading road, hired out often, invisible in the way enslaved women were trained to be invisible. She cooked, carried water, listened, and she laughed when white men laughed, lowering her eyes, letting them believe she was harmless. Silly, some said. Simple. Safe. That assumption would follow them into the dark. By the early 1840s, the business of slave catching had intensified. Escapes increased as the Underground Railroad expanded and rumors of safe houses spread. Patrols grew larger, more aggressive. Groups of armed men rode out in teams, confident that numbers made them untouchable. They trusted local tips, rumors passed in taverns, information squeezed from enslaved people with threats or promises. Hannah learned quickly what kind of information they valued. She learned the tone of urgency in their voices when they thought they were close. She learned how badly they wanted to believe that freedom was careless, that fugitives were foolish enough to leave clear signs. And she learned that these men, so certain of their power, rarely questioned the word of an enslaved woman who seemed eager to please. It began with laughter. According to later testimony, she made a show of herself. She pretended to misunderstand directions, to confuse north and south, to mix up names of creeks and roads. When corrected, she apologized too much, smiling, playing the fool. And then, quietly, she told them what they wanted to hear. A path through the woods. A light seen near the river. A group moving at night. The trick was not in what she said, but in what she let them assume. The first men never returned. At least, not the way they left. One group vanished entirely. Another was found days later, bodies discovered by farmers who followed the smell. Newspapers described accidents. A fall into a ravine. An illness. An unfortunate encounter with the terrain. The language was careful, almost embarrassed. Slave catchers were not supposed to die like that. Then it happened again, and again. Over 11 nights, 38 men were lost. Some disappeared so completely their names were argued over later. Others were buried in hurried graves. Causes of death whispered, but never written. The countryside began to change. Patrols hesitated. Dogs whined and refused to advance. Lanterns flickered out earlier than planned. Men who had once boasted now drank in silence. What spread faster than the fear was the confusion. There was no rebellion to point to, no armed uprising. No sign of organized resistance that could be crushed. Instead, there were only wrong turns, bad luck, and the unsettling feeling of being guided by something unseen. The land itself seemed hostile, swallowing men who believed they owned it. Hannah continued her work. She was still seen carrying water, still hired out, still overlooked. If questioned, she cried easily, swore she knew nothing. To the masters and patrol leaders, the idea that an enslaved woman could orchestrate such devastation was unthinkable. Violence, in their minds, came from open defiance, not quiet compliance. But among the enslaved, something else circulated. Stories of a woman who sent hunters chasing ghosts. Of laughter that hid intention. Of freedom protected not by guns, but by misdirection. The tale grew, changed, became a warning and a prayer at once. Eventually, the patrols stopped coming to that stretch of road. No trial was ever held. No reward notice named her. History, written by those who survived, left her mostly in the margins. Yet the numbers lingered in scattered records, in insurance claims, in the sudden absence of familiar names from rosters and rolls. 38 men, 11 nights, and one woman everyone thought was silly. As dawn broke on the 12th morning, Hannah stood at the edge of the property, watching riders turn back before reaching the trees. Her face showed nothing, but the land was quiet in a way it had never been before. And somewhere beyond the woods, people who would never know her name kept walking north, unaware of the cost already paid for their silence and their chance. The quiet did not mean safety. In the South, silence often signaled something gathering just out of sight. When the patrols withdrew from the road near the river place, masters began to ask why. Letters moved between counties. Sheriffs spoke in lowered voices. 38 men could not simply vanish without explanation, not when money, reputation, and authority were at stake. Someone had to be blamed, even if no one knew how. Plantation owners first suspected outside agitators. Northern abolitionists, they said, armed fugitives hiding deep in the swamps. A secret camp. They sent scouts who knew the land better, men born to the region, men who did not drink as much and who trusted fewer smiles. Still, those scouts came back shaken, reporting nothing concrete, only trails that led nowhere and sounds at night that could not be explained. Hannah listened as all of this unfolded. She learned that fear changes people. Men who once barked orders now hesitated. They argued over routes, over leadership. They disagreed loudly in daylight and whispered after dark. The illusion of control had cracked, and once cracked, it could not be repaired easily. Hannah did not need to act every night anymore. The damage had already been done. Doubt was doing the rest. But doubt, too, invites cruelty. As the losses mounted, suspicion turned inward. Enslaved people were questioned harder, punished more severely. Some were sold south just in case. Hannah saw the bruises. She heard the screams carried on the same wind that once carried freedom whispers. The price of her success was being paid by others, and she understood that clearly. That understanding sharpened her resolve. She began to alter her trick. Where once she gave false directions, now she offered partial truths. A real creek, but the wrong bend. A genuine safe house, long abandoned. She fed patrols just enough accuracy to keep them moving, just enough hope to keep them coming back, and just enough error to lead them into exhaustion, exposure, and sometimes fatal mistakes. Not every death was dramatic. Some men drowned crossing swollen rivers at night. Others succumbed to sickness after days lost in wetlands. A few fell to accidents with their own weapons. In the records, these deaths look ordinary. That ordinariness is what protected her. Ordinary deaths do not demand extraordinary explanations. What made the situation unbearable for authorities was not the loss of life alone, but the loss of confidence. Slave catching relied on intimidation. It depended on the belief that escape would always be punished and that punishment would always be swift. Hannah's quiet campaign disrupted that belief. People began to run who never would have tried before. Plantation owners noticed the absences. Fields were shorthanded. Kitchens were quieter. People slipped away at night, not in desperation, but with planning. They avoided the road near the river, knowing patrols feared it. Knowledge traveled without maps or ink, carried in songs altered slightly, in pauses during prayer, in the careful phrasing of warnings shared between chores. Hannah became part of that network, though no one ever named her as its center. That was another layer of protection. There is no single leader to capture, no figurehead to hang as a warning. Just a series of small, deniable choices made by someone everyone underestimated. Still, danger closed in. One evening, a new patrol arrived without announcing itself. No boasting. No loud questions. They observed first. They watched who moved where, who spoke to whom. Hannah felt it immediately. The air changed. The usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something colder. These men did not ask for help. They demanded it. When Hannah was questioned, she answered carefully, returning to the role that had kept her alive for so long. Confusion, nervous laughter, tears. She offered useless details, hoping to frustrate them into leaving. But one of the men watched her longer than the others. He did not interrupt. He did not smile. He had seen patterns before. That night, Hannah did not sleep. She understood that the trick worked only as long as it was not named. The moment someone recognized it as strategy rather than stupidity, her life would narrow to hours, maybe minutes. She considered running, but she knew the land too well to believe escape would be simple. Instead, she waited. At dawn, the patrol rode out, following directions she had given, directions close enough to truth to feel convincing. Hannah stood where she always stood, watching them disappear into the trees. Her face showed nothing, but her hands shook, because this time the forest did not feel like an ally. As the sound of hooves faded, another sound took its place, dogs, closer than before, baying with purpose. And Hannah realized that the game she had been playing in the margins of history was about to be dragged into the open, where silence could no longer protect her. The dogs were not supposed to be there. They had learned, over weeks of failure, that animals sensed what men refused to acknowledge. Horses balked. Dogs panicked. The land itself resisted. So this new patrol brought different dogs, trained farther south, hardened by blood and distance. Their bay cut through the morning like a blade, precise and disciplined, no longer confused by the swamp. Hannah felt the sound in her chest before she understood it with her mind. She moved as she always did, slow, unremarkable, carrying a basket she did not need to carry. Around her, the plantation stirred. Smoke rose. Orders were shouted. Life pretended to be normal. But beneath that surface, people noticed. Enslaved men paused too long in their work. Women looked up from washing with faces gone still. Everyone heard the dogs. This was no routine search. The patrol did not vanish that night. They returned at dusk, wet and angry, but alive. That alone told Hannah everything. Her directions had not worked the way they once did. Either the men were smarter, or the land was no longer enough to finish what she started. The man who had watched her before dismounted last. He did not accuse her. Not yet. He asked her name again, though he already knew it. He asked where she was born. He asked who she spoke to during the day. His voice was calm, almost gentle, and that was what frightened her most. Violence, she understood. This was something else. This was recognition forming. That night, she was locked inside, a precaution they called it. No chance, no marks. Just a door closed from the outside. They were waiting to see who would come looking for her. No one did. Not because she was unloved, but because the network understood danger. Survival depended on restraint. Silence. The hardest discipline of all. Hannah sat in the dark and listened to the plantation breathe, knowing that the very invisibility that had protected her might now allow her to disappear without notice. In the early hours before dawn, the man returned. He did not bring dogs or weapons, only a lantern. He set it down between them and spoke quietly, as if sharing a secret. He told her about the missing men, about the rumors, about the way fear had spread faster than rebellion ever could. He did not say her name with hatred. He said it with curiosity. "You don't look dangerous," he said. She smiled just a little, the smile that had guided so many others into the dark. He watched it carefully. The next day, she was released. No explanation given. The patrol left the property, but did not leave the area. Hannah understood the shift immediately. They were no longer chasing fugitives. They were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to speak to the wrong person, to reveal herself through urgency or pride. So she stopped acting. Days passed, then weeks. No false directions, no whispered tips. She became exactly what they expected, another enslaved woman enduring, surviving, shrinking into routine. The flow of escape slowed. The road near the river grew quiet again, not from fear, but from uncertainty. People did not know if the protection was gone or simply paused. Hannah felt the weight of that pause more heavily than any chain. At night, she dreamed of the men who had died. Not their faces, but their boots abandoned in mud. Their voices confident and wrong. She did not celebrate them. She had never wanted death. What she wanted was space. Time. Enough confusion for others to move through the cracks. She began to believe the moment had passed. Then, on the 11th night after the patrol arrived, the man with the lantern disappeared. His absence caused an uproar. He was not a local hire. He was important. Questions turned sharp again. fast and careless. Dogs were brought back. This time, they did not bay with confidence. They circled. They whined. They refused the river path entirely. The men argued. Voices rose. Accusations flew without names attached. Someone finally said Hannah's name out loud. She was seized before dawn, dragged from her quarters without ceremony. This time, there was no pretense of protection. Rope it into her wrists. Neighbors were forced to watch. The message was clear. Whatever had been happening in the dark would now be answered in the light. As they pulled her toward the road, Hannah saw something no one else noticed. At the edge of the trees, just beyond where the dogs would not go, a shape lay half submerged in water. A hat she recognized. A lantern cracked, but unbroken, its glass clouded with mud. The man had followed her old directions after all. As the rope tightened and the crowd murmured, Hannah lifted her head. For the first time in weeks, she felt the land lean toward her again, listening. And in that moment, she knew the story was not finished. Not for her, and not for the people still moving north, counting on the darkness to remember what men tried so hard to forget. They did not know what to do with her. That uncertainty was dangerous. In the slave system, hesitation often led to spectacle. When authority felt challenged, it responded not with investigation, but with display. Hannah was tied beneath a tree near the road, close enough for travelers to see, far enough that her screams, if she gave any, would not disrupt the house. She gave none. The men argued among themselves. Some wanted a confession. Others wanted an example. A few wanted to wait for orders that never came. The disappearance of the patrol leader had shaken them more deeply than they admitted. He had been careful, methodical. If he could vanish, then so could any of them. They questioned Hannah again and again. She said little. When she spoke, it was only to repeat what she had always said. She was confused. She did not know. She only tried to help. She cried at the right moments. She trembled. She performed the role that had kept her alive. But something had changed. The men no longer found comfort in her weakness. Instead, it unsettled them, because weakness was not supposed to produce consequences. As night fell, a storm rolled in from the west. Heavy, sudden. Rain hammered the ground, drowning out sound, blurring distance. One man suggested moving her inside. Another refused. They left her where she was, exposed, believing the weather itself would break her. The storm did something else instead. In the chaos of wind and rain, the dogs panicked. Their handlers struggled to keep control. Lanterns sputtered. Orders were lost in the noise. For a brief moment, the world returned to disorder. The same disorder Hannah had learned to weaponize. No one saw who cut the rope. No one later agreed on how it happened. Some swore they heard a branch snap. Others blamed the storm. By the time the shouting settled and the lantern steadied, Hannah was gone. The tree stood empty, rope ends frayed and wet, swinging gently as if the land itself had exhaled. They searched until dawn. They found nothing but mud, broken reeds, and a familiar refusal of the forest to cooperate. One man slipped and broke his leg. Another lost his horse. When daylight fully arrived, exhaustion replaced rage. Hannah had not simply escaped. She had vanished back into the margins where she had always lived. Her disappearance marked a turning point. Patrols were reduced after that. Routes were shortened. Men demanded higher pay or refused assignments altogether. The road near the river earned a reputation, one that did not need explanation. It became a place where confidence failed, where dogs would not go, where something small and overlooked had undone something large and armed. Hannah herself was never captured. Some said she went north. Others claimed she crossed into Indian territory. A few believed she never left at all, that she remained close, protected by the very fear she had created. The truth, like so much else, dissolved into rumor. But the impact did not. In the years that followed, escape patterns shifted across the region. Enslaved people spoke of listening carefully, of using misdirection rather than speed, of surviving by being underestimated. Hannah's story, never written, never official, became a lesson passed quietly from one voice to another. Power, it taught, does not always announce itself. And resistance does not always look like rebellion. As the nation moved closer to war, as laws hardened and then cracked under their own weight, the memory of those 11 nights lingered in the background. 38 men, armed and authorized, undone not by force, but by assumption. The last record connected to Hannah is not a name, but a note in a county ledger, written years later in a different hand. It mentions a stretch of land still avoided by patrols, long after slavery itself began to collapse. Reason: unreliable terrain. But terrain does not think. It does not plan. It does not smile and listen and wait. Someone did. And as America hurtled toward its breaking point, that truth, quiet, unsettling, and unfinished, remained buried just beneath the surface, ready to be remembered when the story of freedom demanded a reckoning. Years later, when the country tried to explain itself, Hannah was nowhere to be found in the explanations. After the storm, after her escape, after the road near the river slipped quietly out of use, officials chose forgetfulness. It was easier that way. Ledgers were cleaned up. Patrol rosters were revised. Deaths were folded into vague language. Accidents, illness, misadventure. 38 men reduced to paperwork that avoided asking why armed authority had failed so completely. But forgetting never works evenly. Among white communities, the story thinned into superstition. The woods were cursed. The river shifted at night. Dogs went mad there. It was spoken of with half-smiles, as if humor could tame what fear had never understood. Men warned each other not to linger, not to boast, not to trust directions from anyone who seemed too eager to help. Among the enslaved, the story sharpened. It was told carefully, stripped of names and dates, shaped to survive. A woman who listened more than she spoke. A woman who survived by being dismissed. A warning that power often collapses under its own certainty. Children learned it not as history, but as instinct. Do not rush. Do not reveal yourself. Let them believe what they want. As the 1850s hardened into law and blood, the South changed. Patrols grew harsher again in some places, desperate to reclaim authority. In others, they quietly retreated, relying more on fear than pursuit. The Underground Railroad adapted, becoming less visible, more fragmented, harder to destroy. Historians would later argue about causes, about economics, about politics, about ideology. They would not argue about Hannah. Because Hannah left no manifesto, no confession, no trial transcript. She left only absence, and absence is difficult to measure. It was her absence that unnerved those who had tried to contain her. She was proof that resistance did not require armies or speeches. It could exist inside routine, inside obedience, inside a smile mistaken for ignorance. In one surviving letter from a former patrolman, written years later from a different state, there is a single line that does not quite fit the rest. It is not addressed to anyone in particular. It reads like a confession written only for the writer himself. "We were not hunted," he wrote. "We were led." By the time the Civil War came, the road near the river was overgrown. Nature reclaimed what fear had abandoned. Trees erased paths. Water swallowed footprints. The land returned to being simply land, no longer burdened with the weight of what it had witnessed. But stories do not decay the way roads do. Long after emancipation, long after uniforms changed and laws were rewritten, the stories surfaced again and again, in oral histories, in fragments of testimony, in questions historians could not answer cleanly. How did so many men die without a single recorded battle? Why did patrols avoid certain areas long before open rebellion made avoidance sensible? The answers lived between the lines. They lived in the understanding that the enslaved were never as powerless as the system required them to be. That survival demanded intelligence, restraint, and sometimes deception so subtle it looked like foolishness. Hannah's trick was called silly because calling it anything else would have been unbearable. To admit strategy was to admit equality. To admit intelligence was to admit humanity. And to admit humanity would have unraveled everything. As this story moves forward, toward the war that would finally expose the contradictions of a nation, one question remains unanswered. What happened to Hannah herself? Did she reach freedom? Did she die unnamed? Or did she live long enough to watch a country burn for refusing to see what had been standing in front of it all along? That question, unresolved, uncomfortable, and deliberately ignored, is where the next part begins. After the war, America rushed to explain itself. Battles were mapped. Generals were carved into stone. Dates were memorized. Causes simplified. Emancipation became a moment, a signature, a proclamation, as if freedom had arrived all at once, clean and undeniable. But for those who had lived in the shadows before the war, history did not feel so orderly. It felt unfinished. In the decades that followed, federal officials traveled the South collecting testimonies from formerly enslaved people. They asked about whippings, auctions, escapes, owners. They were searching for clarity, for narratives that fit neatly into reports. Again and again, interviewers noted long pauses when questions turned to resistance. Some things were still dangerous to say out loud. In one account from a woman interviewed in the 1870s, there is a brief, almost throwaway line. She mentions a place by a river that no one used anymore, even back then. She laughs in the transcript. The interviewer does not ask why. He moves on. That laughter echoes Hannah's. By then, the South had learned new ways to enforce old hierarchies. Slave patrols were gone, but their logic survived in uniforms with different names. Roads were reopened, but some stretches remained curiously empty. Children were warned not to wander near certain woods, not because of ghosts, but because bad things happened there. No one could say exactly what those bad things were. Hannah, if she was still alive, would have been an old woman by then. Or perhaps she had already died decades earlier, her passing unmarked, her name misspelled or never written at all. That is the cruelty of undocumented lives. Even survival leaves no proof. Yet the effects of her actions were measurable. Escape attempts in that region had spiked sharply in the years before the war. Patrol budgets had quietly increased and then collapsed. Insurance claims had risen in ways that made no sense on paper. These anomalies puzzled later clerks and historians, who often dismissed them as clerical errors. They were not errors. They were traces. What made Hannah's story dangerous, even after slavery ended, was not the death of the men, but the method. She had exposed a flaw in power that outlived the institution itself. Authority depended on being believed, on being obeyed without question. Once people understood that it could be redirected, delayed, confused, it lost its absolute shape. That lesson carried forward. It appeared in strikes where workers played dumb to slow machines, in civil rights actions where compliance was used to reveal injustice, in moments when those deemed powerless survived by mastering the expectations placed upon them. All of it echoed the same truth. Underestimation is not neutral. It is a vulnerability. Hannah never needed to be remembered as a hero to matter. In fact, her power came from not being remembered clearly at all, from existing as a blur in the record, a problem no one wanted to define too sharply. Because once you define it, you have to confront it. And America has never been comfortable confronting the idea that some of its most effective resistance came not from speeches or armies, but from people it refused to see as capable of thought. As scholars continue to uncover fragments, ledgers, letters, half-forgotten warnings, Hannah's presence becomes more distinct by remaining indistinct. A negative space in history, shaped by fear, silence, and the careful avoidance of explanation. The trick, once called silly, begins to look precise. The woman, once called harmless, begins to look intentional. And the question that lingers now is not how 38 men died. It is how many more systems have been quietly redirected by people history still calls invisible. Because somewhere between what was written and what was lived, Hannah is still waiting, asking whether this nation is finally ready to recognize the intelligence it once mistook for foolishness. And that recognition, when it comes, may be far more unsettling than any ghost story about a road by the river. Recognition, when it finally comes, rarely arrives as an apology. More often, it arrives as discomfort. In the late 20th century, historians began revisiting the margins of slavery's story, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. Too many records did not add up. Too many gaps resisted explanation. Too many local legends contradicted official accounts. The deeper scholars looked, the clearer it became that resistance had not been rare. It had simply been misread, especially when it came from women. Enslaved women were cataloged as labor, as property, as background. Their intelligence was underestimated by design. That made them dangerous in ways no patrol manual could prepare for. Hannah was not unique because she resisted. She was unique because she exploited the very blindness meant to contain her. What frightened authorities was not that she lied. It was that they trusted her lies. Trust, once broken, does not return easily. Long after Hannah vanished, patrol leaders across the South adjusted their behavior. They stopped asking certain questions. They stopped relying on certain sources. In doing so, they also weakened themselves, cutting off the very information networks that had sustained their power. The system grew louder, harsher, more violent, but also clumsier. That clumsiness mattered. It created space. Not enough space for everyone. Never enough. But enough for some to slip through, to survive, to carry knowledge forward. Hannah's legacy was not the men who died. It was the people who lived because authority hesitated when it once would have advanced without thought. Still, the temptation remains to turn her into myth. A single woman outwitting an entire system. A perfect trick. 11 nights. 38 men. Clean numbers, satisfying symmetry. The truth was messy, eh? Fear spread unevenly. Luck played its part. Weather mattered. So did timing, and mistakes, and the willingness of others to stay silent when silence was the hardest choice. Hannah did not act alone, even if she acted quietly. And that is what makes her story dangerous even now. It refuses to fit into a simple narrative of lone heroism. It insists on something more unsettling. That oppressive systems are often undone not by dramatic confrontation, but by ordinary people making small, coordinated decisions within the cracks. That kind of resistance is hard to celebrate. It offers no statues, no clear villains defeated in a single moment, no ending that feels complete. Perhaps that is why Hannah remains unresolved. We do not know where she died, or if she died free. We do not know whose lives she directly saved, or how many paid a price she never intended. What we know is that she forced a system built on certainty to doubt itself, and doubt, once introduced, spreads. As the story continues forward in time, into Reconstruction and its failures, into new forms of control disguised as progress, Hannah's shadow does not fade. It shifts. It reminds us that the most enduring forms of power are not always the loudest, and the most dangerous resistance is often the kind that looks like compliance. In the next part, the lens widens. We follow the aftershocks, how fear traveled, how tactics evolved, and how the same assumptions that doomed slave catchers would resurface again, reshaping the nation in ways few were willing to acknowledge. Because Hannah's story does not end with her disappearance. It ends with a question America is still avoiding. What happens when the people you underestimate learn exactly how to use your expectations against you? They called her silly. They called her nothing at all. But men vanished. Roads emptied. Freedom moved quietly through the dark. She did not shout. She did not fight. She waited. And in that waiting, a system built on certainty learned fear. Her name was lost. Her work was not. Because somewhere in the American night, power followed a smile it did not respect. And never came back. Fade to black.